Hello everyone. To start, I thank you for organising and being at this important commemoration and apologise for not being with you in real time. I honour and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you meet today and from which I am speaking, and I recognise not only that their sovereignty was never ceded, but also that contemporary Australia has so much to learn about how Australia's First Peoples understand and exercise their sovereignty. And I remember the sinking of the SIEVX as if it were yesterday, honour the lives and families of those who were lost, and remain determined to play some small part in trying to ensure that such a preventable tragedy is averted by policies that are principled and protective. With that in mind, my objective today is to explain why I believe the claim encapsulated in words of John Howard in 2001 that I suspect are emblazoned on your minds should be turned into a question. We shall decide who comes here and the circumstances in which they come. Imagine if we framed it this way. Can we decide who comes here? And can we decide when and how and in what circumstances they come? Howard's words do not make a new claim, but as you all know, they were popularised in the context of the Tampa scandal. On the contrary, his words give expression to a long-standing idea for which I use the shorthand absolute sovereignty. The idea that there is an absolute sovereign right to exclude and condition the entry and stay of aliens. It is an idea that has, in Australia, become deeply entrenched in our constitution, in our legislation, and even in our courts. That makes it a monster to move. Based on my research, I've concluded that this monster is not impenetrable doctrine, but an idea that, while deeply entrenched in the Australian legal and political psyche, is built on sand. For me, this research was not an obscure or ethereal academic frolic. First and foremost, I'm a human rights lawyer, and I was motivated by my own experience representing and advocating for people seeking asylum in Australia, often by boat, subject to mandatory detention on or offshore, or to policies that planned for their destitution. The common approach for people like me is to identify standards and breaches and craft arguments that provide the foundation to advocate for change. Certainly I saw and continue to see all these issues as human rights problems. But what I could see was that there was a major obstacle to this approach that I had always been discomforted by and that I needed to understand better. That obstacle, that monster, was absolute sovereignty. My questions about absolute sovereignty prompted me to take a look at how the relationship between the foreigner and the sovereign was shaped over time. I looked at this question in three phases: early international law, the common law, and the Australian Constitution. Before I go any further, I want to play a little mind game with you. Let's imagine who we think of as a foreigner in Australia. We may, for example, think of the foreigner as an outsider, as someone who is not an Australian citizen, someone who needs a visa. And we're pretty clear that foreigners have less rights than citizens, aren't we? Well, what I found was that early international law gave the foreigner a whole bunch of rights. Rights to set forth and travel, to sojourn, to trade, to share in common property, free movement rights, and the right to enter and reside, wait for it, in the territory of another state. I started to think, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Who is this foreigner? In essence, what I found was that the foreigner in early international law was an imperialising European, carrying international law in their pockets to conquer and claim the coastlines of the New World. In other words, the foreigner was not an outsider, but international law's insider. So, in contrast to the subjugated barbarian inhabitants of the New World, that's why the foreigner had all these rights. But sovereignty was not framed, even then, in absolute terms. That changed in the 19th century as the migratory landscape changed. Law and policy makers in white settler societies of the British Empire started grappling with the idea of an absolute sovereign right to exclude as a way of regulating the movement of other peoples. Think, for example, the Chinese. Crucial distortions of the scope and meaning of sovereignty by the courts referenced extracts from early international law selectively, inaccurately and out of context. They papered over, for example, exceptions to sovereignty arising from the duties of humanity. This gave rise to what I've characterised as myth conceptions of sovereignty, legal mythologies that grew the absolute sovereign right to exclude into an uncontroversial truth. And it was from this that a collective hostility towards the unwanted migrant could emerge and become entrenched. As such, the racist ideologies of that time were embraced in the courts, treating absolute sovereignty as settled law that was not open to controversy. It's a claim that was allowed to become the state's talisman and the migrant's curse. Today, as we know only too well, absolute sovereignty has not lost its sting, and the courts are yet to engage with the distortions, selectivity and misconceptions that have shaped the way absolute sovereignty is understood, even though they continue to apply those laws today. In my estimation, there is more, much more, the courts can do to question this dangerous idea. And there is always more we can do too. So to close, I want to offer you 2 short poems that have inspired me and capture why this is an idea that we must resist. The first is from Virgil's Aeneid and conveys the inhumanity and barbarism of absolute sovereignty. What men, what monsters, what inhuman race, what laws, what barbarous customs of the place shut up a desert shore to drowning men and drive us to the cruel seas again. The second is from Michael Leunig, and it captures absolute sovereignty's futility. Life is porous, the whole world leaks. There's no such thing as a perfect seal. It all gets out, it all gets in. Everything leaks into everything, so that everything can heal. What a terrible, sad neurosis is the fear of this osmosis. So while this inhuman, barbaric and futile idea of absolute sovereignty may be a monster to move, I'm an optimist and I firmly believe that it can. Thanks for your time today.